Welcome to this explainer. We're diving straight into a massive diplomatic event from August 2026, Vietnamese President To Lam's state visit to Australia. Now, on the surface, state visits can sometimes just look like standard diplomatic protocol, right? A lot of handshakes and photo ops. But this one was uniquely significant. It was specifically designed to take the broad, high-level agreements of their 2024 Comprehensive Strategic Partnership and actually operationalize them. In this analysis, we're going to look strictly at the facts and the documents that emerged from this summit to understand exactly how Australia and Vietnam are attempting to deepen their relationship amidst a highly complex global landscape.
Here's our roadmap. First, we'll track the timeline from 2024 to 2026. Second, we'll dive into economic security and supply chains. Third, maritime and border cooperation. Fourth, we'll break down the competing strategic interpretations. And finally, we'll look at the ultimate implementation test.
All right, let's get into Section 1, from 2024 to 2026, Elevating the Partnership.
To really grasp the significance of the August 2026 visit, we have to rewind just a bit. In March 2024, the two nations elevated their bilateral relations to a Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, or CSP. This was basically a broad architectural framework. Fast forward to June 2025, and we see a crucial intermediate step, a Memorandum of Understanding between Export Finance Australia and the Vietnam Development Bank to explore joint financing. But the real culmination of all this happened in August 2026, when President To Lam arrived in Canberra. That summit was all about moving from that broad 2024 baseline to formal, highly specific operational frameworks.
The transition from that broad 2024 framework to the operational integration we saw in August 2026 is actually pretty stark. On August 11, the two leaders didn't just shake hands, they oversaw the exchange of 3 specific joint statements and 7 cooperation documents. We're talking 6 MoUs and 1 protocol. These are highly targeted frameworks covering everything from the digital economy and vocational training right down to agricultural market access. Yep, they even agreed on market access for Australian game meat. Basically, the bureaucratic mechanisms were put in place to give the 2024 partnership some actual teeth.
Moving on to Section 2, Economic Security and Supply Chains, Resilience through Integration. First off, we need to consider the sheer economic weight of this relationship. According to official data from Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, bilateral two-way trade in goods and services was valued at a massive $30 billion in 2025. $30 billion. This isn't just a polite diplomatic exercise. There is some very serious commercial gravity anchoring these two middle powers together, making their mutual economic resilience an absolute top priority.
So, how does this actually work in practice? Well, the intended institutional architecture for that economic resilience is highly structured. The idea is for Australian capital and technology to interface directly with Vietnamese assets. If you recall that 2025 MoU, Export Finance Australia steps in here to explore joint initiatives with the Vietnam Development Bank. The ultimate goal? To funnel private investment and institutional expertise towards green energy projects, grid infrastructure, and critical mineral reserves in Vietnam. Now, actually, let me clarify something really important here. This is an exploratory framework for financing. It is not an announcement of already dispersed sovereign capital. But it absolutely shows the precise institutional plumbing being built to support mutual supply chains.
Why build all this architecture right now? Well, the official Joint Statement on Economic Resilience Cooperation explicitly aims to safeguard global supply chains against disruption. And recent history shows us exactly why that's so crucial. Remember 2025? Southeast Asian supply chains faced a major shock when the United States temporarily slapped a 40% anti-evasion transshipment duty on them. While those tariffs were eventually rescinded in early 2026, that intense volatility really underscored some deep vulnerabilities in the region. Consequently, this new partnership specifically targets trade diversification and critical technology frameworks, like semiconductors, to build a buffer. They're trying to insulate themselves against future global trade shocks that could disrupt the everyday flow of consumer goods, from your smartphone right down to electric vehicles.
Okay, Section 3, Maritime and Border Cooperation. Enhancing capacity, not alliances.
Now, the August 2026 package wasn't just about economics. It also established formal links between security agencies. We saw an MoU on maritime law enforcement and an MoU on border protection cooperation, literally connecting the Vietnam Coast Guard with the Australian Border Force. But let's be super clear about the main takeaway here. This is strictly about capacity building, information exchange, and improving maritime domain awareness. It's titled a Joint Vision Statement for a reason. It's definitely not a mutual defense pact. Both nations are treading very carefully, deepening their practical, operational security coordination without crossing the line into forming a military alliance.
Section 4. Competing Strategic Interpretations. Official Goals versus Geopolitical Analysis.
Whenever we look at international relations, it's necessary to cleanly separate what is officially stated from how it's analyzed externally. On one side, the official government narratives from both Canberra and Hanoi frame this partnership squarely around regional stability. They heavily emphasize mutual economic resilience, strict adherence to the 1982 UNCLOS framework, and full support for ASEAN centrality and multilateral trade. It's a very pragmatic, cooperative framing. On the flip side, however, independent geopolitical analysis highlights some slightly differing national incentives operating just beneath the surface.
Experts from independent think tanks like the Lowy Institute and ASPI interpret the dynamics like this. Australia is engaging in this partnership partly to de-risk its supply chains by securing alternative critical mineral sources away from a single dominant market. On the other hand, these analysts assess that Vietnam is using the partnership to gain vital technical assistance and capital. And crucially, Vietnam is doing this while rigorously maintaining its famous bamboo diplomacy, which is a strategy of remaining solidly rooted in national interest while swaying flexibly with geopolitical winds. Essentially, Vietnam is pursuing multi-directional hedging to maximize its strategic autonomy. They are upgrading relationships across the board but firmly avoiding being locked into any one geopolitical bloc.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, the implementation test, bridging the gap between frameworks and reality.
When we talk about critical minerals cooperation, the focus almost always lands on rare earth elements. And the gap between Vietnam's geological potential and its actual output is perhaps the most striking data point in this entire analysis. According to authoritative U.S. Geological Survey data, Vietnam possesses a staggering 3.5 million metric tons of estimated rare earth reserves. That is incredible potential. But get this, actual production output for 2025 was approximately 150 metric tons. 3.5 million tons sitting in the ground, but only about 150 tons produced. That gap is wild, and it perfectly highlights the exact challenge of moving from a signed MoU to a fully functioning commercial-scale operation.
So what's causing that massive gap? Well, independent assessments point to some pretty significant administrative constraints. Vietnam is currently undergoing extensive internal governance reforms, and frankly, that has created regulatory bottlenecks and delays in provincial and central investment approvals. If an Australian entity wants to invest in green energy initiatives or grid infrastructure upgrades in Vietnam, it faces incredibly complex cost recovery negotiations and major grid access hurdles. The reality is that domestic administrative delays pose a very genuine risk to actually implementing the investments these bilateral frameworks were designed to encourage in the first place.
Based on those constraints, we're basically looking at two distinct paths for this partnership over the next few years. Scenario A is the optimistic path, steady implementation. The trigger here is Vietnam successfully streamlining its administrative processes. If that happens, the outcome is Australian agencies and private capital advancing into active, finalized renewable energy and critical mineral projects by 2028. Then there's Scenario B, the pessimistic path, bureaucratic delays. If protracted regulatory hurdles and grid access issues persist in Vietnam, these signed MoUs are going to really struggle to translate into commercial contracts. And in that scenario, the grand economic resilience agenda we've been talking about, it largely remains just that, aspirational.
To wrap up this explainer, let's separate what we definitely know from what we don't. What is definitively known is that the August 2026 visit successfully deepened the diplomatic architecture, adding specific operational frameworks, MoUs, and border agency links to the 2024 partnership. What is disputed, primarily among regional observers, is whether this deeper cooperation signals any real shift in Vietnam's strategic alignment. The most analysts strongly argue it remains firmly non-aligned. And what is still largely unknown is the ultimate commercial realization of these agreements. The future scale of critical mineral extraction is up in the air, and there is no hard evidence yet of finalized, dispersed project financing directly resulting from this summit.
This leaves us with one defining question to watch moving forward. The diplomatic signatures are dry, and the institutional frameworks have been established. But will these new bilateral frameworks actually overcome domestic administrative bottlenecks to produce active, commercial-scale infrastructure contracts? That is the true implementation test. And the answer to that question will determine whether this strategic partnership becomes a powerful operational reality or remains merely an aspirational blueprint. Thank you for joining us for this explainer, and be sure to keep a close eye on those future trade and investment indicators.